campers, we got a little bedtime story for you on how Monsanto was born. What they did is they developed Agent Orange back in the Vietnam era. We all know how potent and nasty that stuff was. Well, after the war, they had to turn their chemical factories into bioengineering labs. And this is where they developed Roundup. So I guess they turned that nerve gas into Roundup, and that's where their big claim to fame was. But they were also into bioengineering and genetics. So that's where they really started delving off into that, knowing that they were going to create a billion-dollar industry if they could control the seed market. So what they did is in 1984, they went to go visit President Bush, who was then vice president under Reagan, to ask for regulations. They needed these regulations because they knew they were going to have a lot of public outcry for bioengineered crops, and also to protect their multi-billion-dollar business. So now that they had Bush and to go ahead and endorse their policy, they had the EPA and the FDA both on their side. So what they were doing, Monsanto knew that they couldn't fight the opposition, so they either bought them out or they hired them, such as the case of Sir Richard Dole, who was a world-renowned scientist at the time. They paid him to be their spokesperson to a tune of $1,500 a day, and even more in public speaking events, to basically give credit to the GMO industry by saying there was no credible link to say that it was unsafe. So that was going on for a while, and in 1992, that's when Vice President Dan Quayle, who is now under Bush Sr., came out with the Bush's new economic policy for bioengineering foods. So in just 8 years, they were managed to go to the president, and now they have a new economic or new policy program for bioengineering. All was going well until about August 10th, 1998, when a world-renowned GMO scientist named Dr. Arpad Pusztai, hope I got that right, released a documentary. And in this documentary, he discovered during all his lab experiments how most lab animals that ate GMO crops would die. Well, the next day after he released his documentary, Monsanto called then President Bill Clinton, who called Tony Blair, who called this guy's boss, whose name was Philip James. And the next day, that guy, the scientist, was fired and discredited. So now that they've bought politics and they've corrupted scientists, they were well on their way to dominating a seed market. Now they started finding ways to actually sue farmers here in the States. What had happened is when GMO crops are planted and they cross-pollinate with other crops, the non-GMO crops, then those non-GMO crops are now infected and turned into GMO. So Monsanto basically had like Monsanto police or something, and they went out and they found these fields, and then they started suing the farmers, saying they had infringed on copyright or patents, or even just basically stole their seeds, which they didn't want their seeds. They were growing organically, but not now. Now they're finding themselves in lawsuits, and there was hundreds and thousands of lawsuits filed all over the United States, and probably in other countries too. We just didn't really hear about that. The problem is that Monsanto we have heard about some of it, because in India, they were having such a problem with these, what is now termed terminator seeds. These terminator seeds, what happened is they would grow up only to a certain height, and then they would die prematurely. Well, a lot of these farmers in India bought all these types of seeds, not knowing they were terminator seeds, and they planted them, and all their crops died before they were able to harvest. So India had a mass suicide rate a while back where it was to the tune of 40 people committing suicide a day, mainly the males, because they were the one responsible for the bills and they took it serious. They died. So what this had launched into was basically a monopolization of the seed market. Well, it was found out from 1975 to 1997, only 4 to 8% of seeds were the initial cost of the farmers. But since then, it has doubled or quadrupled. And that was the thing with the Indian guys. Their seed cost was so expensive, they couldn't make the notes, so they killed themselves. But now here in America, the seed cost has turned into such an outrageous amount. There has been from what I understand, a 7-state probe going on against Monsanto because of anti-compensation practices. And what this has turned into is Monsanto has basically given rebates to distributors to exclude other vendor seeds, so making them pretty much the only seeds available. So hopefully that will get investigated and we'll even get to hear something about it. Who knows? But the really good news is now France had just sued Monsanto and won. And get this, Monsanto was claiming that Roundup was biodegradable and left a clean soil with no residues. A blatant, flat-out lie. Well, they lost, and they were fined. How much do you think they were fined? A paltry $22,400. I'm sure one of those guys from Monsanto had that laying in his wallet. He just whipped that out and paid the fine right there, and they went out laughing. But then, soon after, their stock prices fell, so that really hit them in the pocketbook. So it was found out that Monsanto could be sued because for years Monsanto was suing the pants off people, and because they had more money and more lawyers, they were able to get away with it. And speaking of one of their head lawyers, who's now a Supreme Court Justice, Justice Clarence Thomas, who was appointed by, I'm sure you know, the Bush, and he was a Monsanto attorney for years. Now he's a Supreme Court Justice. Hate to see a case go there, right? Well, so now that many people are able to actually sue Monsanto, take them to court, or if they're in court, they will countersue Monsanto for trespassing, for infecting their crops with their GMO seeds, pollen, whatever you want to call it, because it's now trespassing. So all the farmers out there that are having Monsanto problems, you countersue them for trespassing on your property. That's what I heard, and I think it's probably a valid case. Now, after 30 years, what have we really determined about GMO? There's no significant increase in yields. We've had 100% crop failure like in India where they had mass suicides. GM cotton has showed a 40% decrease in income if you're planting that stuff. Roundup is lethal to frogs because of the runoff goes into crops. And some countries are doing no-till, so those crops are actually laying on the ground. And it's even found out that some of the GMO crops are leaching proteins from the crops itself into rivers and streams. That's a whole other story. Now, the big one is the GMO superweeds that are coming from cross-pollination of GMO crops to the weeds, creating superweeds that farmers are unable to control, having to put more and more Roundup and other chemicals just to try to control the weeds. So it's a catch-22. And then the last but not least, lab tests have confirmed that people will die if they eat bad GMO foods. And here's the biggest one, talking about the superweeds, transgene contamination is unavoidable. Just like when they just passed this bill for GMO alfalfa, now GMO alfalfa, when it goes to flower and all the bees carry the pollen around, can start infecting non-GMO alfalfa. So we have a huge problem with transgene transgene contamination. Sorry. Anyhow, it was a long story.